UFC 295 went down this past weekend for its annual Madison Square Garden event. And by the conclusion of this card, it's safe to say that the MMA world had been flipped on its head. And this video is going to consist of me going through the main card winners and discussing potential future matchups for them. But I feel as though it's worth mentioning some points and moments from the prelims as well before we jump into the main card. So, first being Jamal Emmers with an impressive knockout over Denis Buzukja. Jared Gordon, another impressive TKO against Marco Madsen, an excellent sequence of strikes from the clinch. And Mateus Rebecki with an impressive submission against Roosevelt Roberts in the first round of their fight. In the case of Gordon, as well as Emmers, these are very vindicating wins considering Emmers had a competitive decision loss against a prospect before getting this finish against Buzukja. And in the case of Gordon, he had that head clash that put him out against Bobby Green, which became a no contest. And before that, the controversial decision loss to Paddy Pimblett. In the case of Rebecki, he's now 16-1 or 17-1, undefeated in the UFC, and could easily find himself fighting right outside the top 15 in his next matchup. Now that we're past the finishes, it's worth mentioning a couple of great fights that happened on the prelims as well. First, Joshua Van versus Kevin Borjas, a fight that was booked outside the UFC organization originally and was the second fight on the card. Great back and forth war. Both guys landed hard shots. It came down to the body work, the boxing, and the pressure of Joshua Van that gave him the decision. If you didn't get to see that fight, I highly recommend you go back and watch it. That was the leading candidate for fight of the night until Sadykhov versus Sadykhov happened. What a war. Both guys had their moments. Both guys dished out damage. Sadykhov had to fight back from hell just to work his way back into the fight and make it competitive. And it wound up being a draw, meaning there's a possibility that we get to see this fight of the night rebooked again in the near future. Very exciting. And Steve Erceg with an impressive decision over Alessandro Costa, where dangers were presented to him and he had to find ways to work around it for the win. On to the main card. Diego Lopes with an impressive first round knockout against Pat Sabatini. The fact that he was an underdog is absolutely absurd. And his 2023 has been very impressive. He had that short notice debut against Evloev where it was super competitive despite losing. He goes on to finish Gavin Tucker and Pat Sabatini in spectacular fashion in his next two. I think he deserves somebody like Sadiq Youssef. Sadiq Youssef just went 5 rounds with Edson Barbosa. That's valuable experience. And I think that this is a matchup in Youssef and Lopes worth saving for the first quarter of 2024. Benoit Saint-Denis. I like the idea of him pushing up into the top 10, but I still feel as though it's a bit too soon. It was a very impressive finish against Matt Frevola. He took Matt Frevola's ranking in emphatic fashion. But I think the UFC should match him against somebody like Drew Dober. That would be a common opponent between him and Frevola. And when Frevola fought Dober, that was his test for the top 15, and he passed it with flying colors. And there's no real logical matchups inside the top 15 for Saint-Denis at the moment. And he did not withstand much damage in that fight against Frevola. So I think booking him versus Dober early in 2024 makes sense in terms of keeping the momentum that Benoit Saint-Denis has rolling. It's hard to think of another matchup for Jessica Andrade considering what I said in my previous video, which is that she's essentially the matchup that you get when you're on the cusp of title contention, and some fighters win and some fighters lose, and Mackenzie Dern came up on the losing end. So I feel as though the UFC is going to continue doing this with Andrade because Andrade will fight anybody. She's willing to take any matchup, regardless of the juxtaposition that she has on both strawweight and flyweight. And for Mackenzie Dern, I think she should fight somebody closer to the top 10, somebody like Tabitha Ricci or Lupi Godinez. Those two fought on this card as well, and the scheduling and trajectory of their career timelines makes sense. So I think that would be a logical bounce back fight for somebody like Dern, who was on the cusp of title contention before getting finished by a former champion. For Tom Aspinall, I think it makes sense for him to fight Stipe before he fights Jon Jones, but the UFC has been so keen on keeping the matchup between Jon Jones and Stipe alive into 2024 that I think they're just going to make Aspinall wait until that fight happens and then make him fight the winner. You never know. Obviously, the UFC could change their plans instantaneously. We've seen it happen before, but that makes the most sense to me, especially considering the amount of people that were very intrigued and excited to see Jon Jones versus Stipe before it fell out. For Sergei Pavlovich, I think the most logical matchup for him after a loss to Tom Aspinall would be Alexander Volkov. Reason being, Pavlovich and Volkov share a lot of common opponents. Derek Lewis, Pavlovich finished him early. Volkov got finished late by Lewis. Tuivasa, both Pavlovich and Volkov finished him. And then Aspinall beat both Volkov and Pavlovich. So I think a matchup with Volkov would be logical just because Volkov has momentum after the Tuivasa win. And it's a fight for Sergei that will show exactly where his position within the heavyweight rankings is after a loss to somebody in a short notice interim title fight where he wasn't even initially supposed to be on the card to begin with. I'm going to keep the light heavyweight matchups short and sweet just because of the chaos that this division has consisted of since Jon Jones vacated the belt. Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill as soon as Jamal Hill is healthy and ready. And Jiri Prochazka versus the winner of Alexander Rakic and Jan Blachowicz. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a little bit shorter, a little bit more to the point. Not really trying to waste too much time on things that already happened. We have another video coming for UFC Fight Night Allen versus Craig, so keep an eye out for that. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I appreciate you watching. This has been Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk. I'm Michael Trochet, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.